So moving on to how sex chromosomes determine gender. So like we said, human males are heterogametic because they have two different sex chromosomes, X and Y, and human females are said to be homogametic because they have two X chromosomes. In other species, sex can be determined in many ways. In birds and snakes, for example, it's the opposite. Males are homogametic, ZZ, and females are heterogametic, ZW. So it's interesting that it's reversed in those species. So let's look closely at X and Y chromosome. X chromosome contains 1,500 genes. It's larger than the Y chromosome. It acts as a homologue to the Y chromosome in males. Y chromosome contains about 231 genes. There are many DNA segments on it which are palindromes, and they may destabilize DNA during replication. And so here we have again a picture of X and a Y chromosome. And one question you might have, during meiosis, how do X and Y chromosomes line up in males during meiosis if they are so different? So it turns out that on the Y chromosome and on the X chromosome, there are regions called PAR, pseudo-autosomal regions. And these are the genes that are shared between X and Y chromosomes. So in PAR1 and PAR2 regions, you actually have genes which are shared between X and Y chromosomes. Okay? And basically, on the Y chromosome, you also have the SRY gene, which, like I said, is very important for male development. 95% of the Y chromosome codes for male-specific genes. Another gene on that chromosome is, AZF gene, which codes for azoospermia factor, important in sperm development. There are a number of other genes important for sperm development. There are also genes for tooth enamel formation, bone development. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about other interesting uh, topics associated with sexual development. So homosexuality is defined as physical attraction towards the members of the same sex. Homosexuality has been seen in all cultures for thousands of years, and there is some evidence that it has been documented in different animal species. It seems that homosexuality is a complex trait determined by both genetic and environmental effects. They have done a study, a number of studies where they looked at identical twins and fraternal twins, and they found that identical twins are more likely to be homosexual than members of fraternal twin pairs. So this indicates that there is some genetic component to this. They have identified a genetic marker on X chromosome on the long arm in region 28, so XQ28, which seems to be linked to the homosexuality as a trait. Okay, so when we look at, again, just to summarize someone's sexual identity, first of all, at conception, it's already predetermined by the chromosomes, right? So somebody could be either male or female based on the chromosomes. If their father gave them a Y chromosome, they would be male. If their father gave them an X chromosome, they would be female. Of course, it's not just the dad who determines this. It also depends on when during mom's cycle the two parents got together, because as we know, for example, during ovulation, female reproductive tract secretes mucus, which is very fluid, very light. So this allows sperm cells to travel easier, and uh, sperms carrying the Y chromosome are lighter than sperms carrying the X chromosome. So sperms that carry the Y chromosome will travel faster, reach the egg cell, and this might result in fertilization, leading to a baby boy being born eventually. But during earlier on in the cycle, before ovulation, if suppose parents, men, mom and dad got together and had sex during, like a few days before ovulation. At that time, the mucus secreted from the cervix is more sticky. So sperm which carry the Y chromosome, they will get stuck in that sticky mucus, and they will not make it to the egg. They might still be able to make it, but they have less of an advantage to make it to the egg cell. Sperm carrying the X chromosome are heavier, so they'll be able to travel through this thick mucus easier, and there's more of a chance of them reaching the egg cell. So basically, then you might have a baby girl, right? So I once watched the Jerry Springer show where you had couples, and the fathers were blaming the mothers on the show that they wanted to have a baby boy and they ended up with a baby girl. So it was one of those crazy Jerry Springer type shows, and they invited a geneticist, and the geneticist was explaining to this fathers who were acting in this really inappropriate, crazy way. They were explaining to them that they gave the Y chromosome or the X chromosome. It's really the dad who gives the chromosome, so the mom is not to blame. But the take-home message from this, it takes two to tango. It's the dad who gives the Y or the X chromosome, but it's also the mom who her reproductive tract allows the sperm to travel and reach the egg cell. So it depends on during what time in the cycle this fertilization is taking place. Okay, so now let's look at gonadal sex. Again, we said that at 6 weeks of after fertilization, we have undifferentiated gonads. They did not decide yet if they're testes or ovaries. And we also have two sets of reproductive tracts, Mullerian and Wolffian. So at this point, you might say that the embryo is both male and female in some way. And then, if the baby has the Y chromosome, it would have a gene called SRY gene, and this gene will code for a transcription factor. So again, our favorite term, transcription factor. Transcription factor proteins are really, really cool. So we have SRY, transcription factor, which is gonna drive the undifferentiated structure to become testes. Testes will secrete testosterone. It will destroy the Mullerian female ducts, promote Wolffian ducts. Interestingly, the X chromosome also have WNT4 gene, which also codes for a transcription factor that promotes female development. However, female development is sort of the default pathway. So if the Y chromosome is not present, it's gonna develop as a female. So development of external and internal reproductive structures continues as male or female responds to the hormones. And this happens around 8 weeks after fertilization. And, if you do an ultrasound around, 10 weeks or 16, and then they usually don't do it at 10 weeks, they do it around 20 weeks, you would see the sex of the baby if you wanted to know the sex of the baby. And later on in puberty, this sexual development continues. So gender identity is defined as strong feelings of being male or female. Gender identity seems to develop from childhood, possibly even earlier than that. And it might have something to do with how our brain is exposed to hormones in the womb. Sexual orientation is yet another component of our sexual identity. It means attraction to the same or opposite sex. So I wanted to talk about an example of a very famous study in psychology. And this was a case about a man named David Riemer, also known as Bruce Riemer. So the story goes like that. In the 70s, in the 60s in Canada, there were two healthy baby boys who were born. They were identical twins, and the parents named them Bruce and Brian. And both Bruce and Brian were healthy little boys, but then they had some infection or some basically irritation that they have developed called phimosis, and it affected their external genitalia. So phimosis is basically irritation of the penile, penis tissue. So both boys developed a condition called phimosis, and they required a circumcision to be performed. So they went to the hospital. They were around 2 years old, and they did circumcision on them. But the doctor who was in charge during that specific appointment, by mistake, he decided to use electrical equipment, which is completely inappropriate. And as a freak accident, he burned off the penis on one of the boys. Bruce's penis was essentially destroyed, and the parents were devastated. They didn't really know how to help their, in the end, the infant, the baby was okay, but they just didn't know what to do because he has this injury, and they weren't able to restore it back. So one time the father was watching a program on TV with this famous psychologist called Dr. Money, spelled as Money. And Dr. Money had this theory that gender identity is a purely social thing. It's determined by the society. It's not influenced by our biology. It's not influenced by genetics. It's just societal. Okay, so he was working with a lot of transgender people, individuals, and he believed that if a boy is raised as a girl, he will be perceiving himself as a girl, and if a girl is raised as a boy, she will become in the end a man. So he believed all of those things are purely social. And when the parents saw the presentation on TV by Dr. Money, they were very inspired. They thought, here's an expert who can help us. In fact, they were already raising Bruce as a girl because Bruce was a very pretty little kid, and he looked great in dresses, and he had wonderful curls. So they thought that, because he didn't have a penis, they were raising him as a girl. And then they called Dr. Money, and they got in touch with him. Dr. Money was really pleased to be introduced to them because here were two identical twins. And by following them up, he could prove that gender is a purely social phenomenon. So he started seeing the boys, interviewing them. Obviously, at that time Bruce was called Brenda, so he called her. She thought she was Brenda, and basically Brenda was very unhappy. She hated playing with girl toys. She hated dolls. She hated wearing dresses. All she wanted was to play with her brother Brian's toys. She wanted the boy clothes. She wanted to be friends with boys. She was very active. She did not like being a girl. But Dr. Money tried to persuade her that she's a girl. He also he wrote a number of papers based on these children, and as they grew up, um, basically Brenda really was unhappy, and when it was the time for her senior prom, she went to the prom as a boy, so she decided to transition to being a boy. She picked the name David. She became David Riemer, and she went to the prom as a boy, and she became very happy being a man, living as a man. And at that time there was another doctor named Dr. Diamond, who was doing studies in rats, and he was a professor at the University of Hawaii, and he had this theory that gender identity also depends on our genetics, our biology, our hormones, and it's predetermined even before birth because of the effects of hormones on the brain. And so he thought that Dr. Money's research must have been fudged. He didn't believe Dr. Money's data. So he decided to find the twin boys that Dr. Money was reporting about in his papers. He found them. He found out that Brenda is living like a guy. She does not like being a girl. So at one of the conferences, Dr. Diamond approached Dr. Money and told him that his research is false, and that and later on David Riemer decided to go public. Dr. Diamond and David Riemer went public, and they eventually wanted to tell the community of psychologists and just to let other people know that gender is not only a social thing. It's a complex multifactorial trait which is based on many factors, including biology and genetics. Interestingly, Dr. Diamond happens to be my husband's uncle. He is my late father-in-law's first cousin, and Dr. Diamond is absolutely brilliant. Okay, and basically, what I was gonna say is Dr. Money, not only he published all of these papers which turned out to be not true. He apparently engaged in some inappropriate things during his interviews, where he was telling the twins about what happens when man and a woman like each other, and he would describe a sexual act to them in detail, and then he would actually ask one of the brothers, like Brian, to get on top of David, aka Brenda, to like he didn't really ask them to do anything, but he would like kind of ask them to get in certain positions, and he also had those interviews videotaped. So all of that was really inappropriate, and David Riemer sued Dr. Money for malpractice and other things, and he got um, he won that case, so he got some compensation. But this story ends tragically because David Riemer committed suicide, partially because of his such a traumatic upbringing, but also because his brother Brian was suffering from schizophrenia and committed suicide before him, so it really affected David um, emotionally and mentally. Also, David was married to this lady, and she divorced him, so that also really had a big impact on David Riemer. And finally, the compensation that he got, he invested it, but somebody, his financial advisor proved to be not a very ethical person, supposedly. So David made some unwise investments, and he lost all of his money, so he went bankrupt, and so that also made him very unhappy. So there were a bunch of factors, and the end of the story is tragic. But the reason I'm really mentioning it, because sexual identity is very strongly influenced by genetics and hormones. It is not just a social construct. Okay, so sex ratios is something that will not be on the test. Basically, it's the proportion of males to females in the human population. It's calculated by the number of males divided by the number of females multiplied by 1,000. So primary sex ratios are calculated at conception, secondary sex ratio are calculated at birth, tertiary sex ratio is calculated at maturity. Sex ratios can change markedly with age. For example, at conception they might be 50-50, but at birth there might be slightly more males than females because of practices where, like in countries like India or China, where sometimes people do an ultrasound and they do this abortions where they eliminate baby girls, because it's preferable to have a boy, especially if you cannot really afford to have a lot of children or you're not allowed to have more than one child. So basically, that can skew the secondary sex ratio at birth. But later on in life, if you look at maturity, especially at the aging population, we see more females than males, more women than men, because statistically women live longer than men, probably because of the protective effects of estrogen. Estrogen has a protective effect on the cardiovascular system. Men tend to have more heart attacks and strokes. It also might be due to differences in lifestyle and the kinds of jobs that men and women tend to do and how they approach those jobs. And but it's just statistically they're more at the later on in life, there seems to be more women than men. It's enough just to go to a nursing home or an assisted living, and sadly you can see that there's fewer men there. You might say that maybe men just don't like going to live in assisted living and they like staying with their kids, or that could be it also. I'm not sure, but the data tells us there are more women than men at the end. So it all reflects medical conditions and environmental factors. So now the time has come to talk about sex-linked traits, so Y-linked traits and X-linked traits. So Y-linked traits, so genes on the Y chromosome are said to be Y-linked. Y-linked traits are very rare, therefore they will not be on the upcoming test. They're transmitted from male to male, from father to son. Females do not have Y chromosome. So mostly currently identified Y-linked traits have to do with male infertility, and they're not typically transmitted, because if a male suffers from infertility, he wouldn't have kids, so he wouldn't transmit it to his son. Another interesting trait on the Y chromosome has to do with male ancestry. So on the Y-linked chromosome, there are certain regions which are associated with male ancestry. Okay, so X-linked traits. X-linked traits, patterns of expression on the X chromosome differ in females and males. So this is very interesting because men get an X chromosome from their mom, but how those genes are expressed in males and females are different. So females, if there's a mutation on an X chromosome, it's said to be an X-linked trait. So in females, X-linked traits are treated like autosomal traits because females have two X chromosomes. In males who have only one single copy of X-linked allele or X-linked mutation, they're said to be hemizygous. Hemizygous. Zygous, hemizygous. So human male is considered hemizygous for X-linked traits. So let's look at the typical Punnett square for males and female for an X-linked trait. So mom gives two X chromosomes, that gives X and Y, and here are the possible combination of kids that they would have. So 50% male, 50% female. So when you do an X-linked trait problem, you would not only you want to put the alleles, but you shouldn't forget to put the X and Y chromosomes in your Punnett square. So let's talk about X-linked recessive inheritance. X-linked recessive inheritance is always expressed in the male. It's expressed in the female who is homozygous for the mutation, so both X chromosomes have the mutant allele, but it's rarely expressed in the heterozygote. Heterozygous females are carriers. Affected males inherit trait from heterozygote to homozygote mom. So they can inherit a trait from their carrier mom or from a mom who is affected. Affected females usually inherit the trait from the affected father and an affected or heterozygous mom. So for example, if dad has hemophilia and the mom is a carrier of hemophilia allele, their daughter will have a 50% chance of being affected by hemophilia because her mom could give her the mutant X, 50% chance that her mom will give her the mutant X and 100% chance that her dad will give her the mutant X. So she has a 50% chance of being affected by hemophilia. Examples of X-linked recessive traits are ichthyosis, which is an enzyme deficiency that blocks the removal of cholesterol from skin cells. So here's an example of ichthyosis. Here we have X-linked recessive trait. You can see that the grandfather is affected. His daughter is a carrier. She carries the mutant X, and she ends up giving that X to her son, and the dad in generation 2, number 2, he gives the Y, so the son is affected. Okay, so there's a 50% chance that the son could be affected if you know it's a boy, right? So if you know it's a boy, so he could either get the healthy X or the mutant X, so there's a 50% chance that their son will be affected. If we didn't know it was a boy and the question was what is the chance of their child being affected, so there's a 1/2 chance that the child will be a boy and there's 1/2 chance that the mom will give the mutant X, so there's 1/4 chance that their child will be affected by this disease. Another example of X-linked recessive trait is color blindness, and another one is hemophilia, which is a blood clotting disease that we already discussed in this class. So here's hemophilia B, and let's look at the sample Punnett square. So you have a carrier mom, so H, capital H stands for the healthy hemophilia allele, and the little h stands for the mutant allele that causes hemophilia. So, and then here we have the dad who has the healthy X chromosome. And now looking at the possible combinations of offspring, you can see that they could have a normal daughter with 2 normal X's, a carrier daughter with 1 mutant X, a son with hemophilia, or a normal son. So notice how they made this Punnett square. When you do the Punnett square for X-linked diseases, especially X-linked recessive disease, you don't only put the H's, you want to put the X and the name of the allele in your Punnett square. So here's the royal family, and we already looked at that, right? And Nicholas the Tsar of Russia and his son Alexei, who had hemophilia. You can see that the Tsar gave him the Y chromosome, and Tsaritsa Alexandra gave him the mutant X, right? So Alexandra happened to be a German princess with roots in the British royal throne, and her great grandmother was Queen Victoria, who potentially was a carrier of this mutation. So now let's talk about X-linked dominant inheritance. So it's expressed in the female in one copy, so it's a dominant trait. So even if you have one mutant X, it will be expressed, a person will be affected. It's much more severe in males, so males with this X-linked dominant condition are usually embryonically lethal, so they're not even born. It results in high rates of miscarriages due to early lethality in males. It's passed on from male to all daughters, but to no sons. So in a typical family with X-linked dominant inheritance, you will see only girls being born, but no sons. So that's a one way. If you had a question like to distinguish between X-linked recessive, X-linked dominant, you should see, if you see that there's no sons born and mostly only affected daughters, it would indicate that it's X-linked dominant. So here is an example of X-linked dominant condition called incontinencia pigmenti. So here, if you look at the Punnett Square, we have XR, where X capital R is the dominant allele, and this is the mutant allele. And the little r is the recessive allele, so that's the healthy allele. And the dad has the healthy X with the healthy little r allele. So these are the possible combinations of offspring that you would get. So you could get unaffected daughters, affected daughters, because they get the capital R on the X chromosome. And then you can see this condition manifests as the severe irritation on the thigh region and any places where there's a lot of like sweat. But in sons, you can see that the affected son will be embryonically lethal, so they won't even be born, and the unaffected son would be healthy. So another example of X-linked dominant trait is congenital generalized hypertrichosis. And in women, this condition, sometimes in the past, they used to refer to women with this condition as a bearded lady. And basically, in women, they would have one affected X, so one X that has the mutant allele, and it would give them a lot of facial hair. So in this condition, the hair grow very close to each other, and this is why it results in this appearance, very dense hair, and in males it's even denser. So sometimes in the past these children were called like wolf children and were given very kind of hurtful names. And in the past, people with this condition sometimes were forced to join like the circus, or they were kind of put on display. um right, so in this family, you can see that we have a mom who was affected. She had a son who was affected, who survived and passed his affected mutant X to his daughters. And you can see he has all unaffected sons, because all the affected sons were embryonically lethal, so they were never born, and he has affected daughters and healthy sons. So this is a typical classical X-linked dominant pedigree. So how do we solve genetic problems with X-linked traits? These are some steps to follow. Look at the inheritance pattern, draw a pedigree, list genotypes and phenotypes and their probabilities, assign genotypes and phenotypes to parents, determine how alleles separate into gametes using a Punnett Square probability, unite the gametes in a Punnett Square, and that's it. And right. So another thing I want to talk about is sex-limited traits. These are traits that affect the structure or function occurring only in one sex. The gene may be autosomal or X-linked. Examples are beard growth, milk production, preeclampsia, and pregnancy. So if a male has a gene that would lead to lower milk production, since a man is not going to breastfeed, having this mutation would not actually affect him. However, having a mutation like that would affect a woman if she wanted to have kids and she wanted to breastfeed them. Again, if a woman has a mutation that predisposes her to low beard growth, so since she is not a man, she doesn't produce as much testosterone, she wouldn't really suffer if she had this particular mutation. However, a man might have, suppose if he wanted to grow a nice beard, and put a photo of himself on Instagram because maybe it's trendy to have a nice beard, he wouldn't be able to achieve maybe that, but I guess eventually he might grow a nice beard. So okay, and sex influence traits. This is when allele is dominant in one sex but recessive in the other. Difference in expression can be caused by hormonal differences between sexes. So actually beard growth can also fall under sex influence trait. Pattern baldness in humans is another one, where in males having a certain gene that predisposes you to male baldness, there are genes on the X chromosome and genes on the autosomes that control pattern baldness in humans. So in the male, this would be more of a dominant trait, but in female, it would be a recessive trait. For example, a heterozygous male is bald, but a heterozygous female is not. She just might have thin hair.